Hello, it's me again, your teacher, Kramer. Today we're looking at William Paley's argument from design, or the teleological argument, or the watchmaker argument, or the look at the eye. I mean, what's the deal with that? Come on. I mean, really, that had to have been designed by something. Argument. It's a bit longer of a title, but I think William Paley would have appreciated that. Paley was a precursor to a number of philosophers who addressed what would be utilizing natural theology, arguing from experience. This is an a posteriori argument. This is an inductive argument, we'll see. Arguing from effects we see in the world to their putative causes. He's also known for a number of other things. He was, prior to Jeremy Bentham, at least influential on Jeremy Bentham with respect to utilitarian thinking. He was extremely influential on philosophers, in particular religious philosophers, at least up until some 7 years later, after he wrote the text you had for today for natural theology, before Darwin. And I think that's significant. He's writing this about 50, 60 years before Darwin's Origin of the Species, and his writing on theories of evolution. That needs to be kept in mind as we go through his argument and his reasoning. It was, however, written after David Hume, which some argue is a very huge weakness of Paley's argument, because the reading we'll see from David Hume in his critique of the argument from design, we'll look at that next week. Some argue that Paley should have known better, that most of the arguments he presents in the reading you had for this time were already addressed by Hume. There's debates about this. I don't want to get into the historical elements of it, but there are people who argue, of course, Paley was aware of Hume's critiques of what would later become the design argument, and that Paley, in fact, is giving a specific argument that addresses those problems. I'll come to that in a bit. But we'll get into, there's people who debate the kind of argument that Paley's offering. Some even say he's attempting a deductive argument, in which case he's trying to show that the conclusion he's offering, that God exists and is a designer, or that a designer exists of the universe, and that designer is God, is in fact deductive, that it follows with certainty if we assume the truth of the premises. That's an uncommon view, I think, interpretation of his argument, and so I'm not going to focus on that. The argument that we will be looking at is an analogical argument. I'm going to follow the majority view on this and assume that Paley intended this as a straightforward argument by analogy. And we'll look again next time with Robin Collins's argument, which is it's not an extension necessarily of Paley's argument. It's a different kind of design argument. There's a number of different design or teleological arguments. That term, of course, we will define. But Paley's attempt here is to make a common sense move from what clearly has design, which clearly has, unquestionably has order, complexity, a function. That term is essential, this functionality, to the conclusion that it had a designer. And when we know about certain cases and then can make comparisons to, analogies to unknown instances, such as, let's say, the Earth or the universe itself, whether or not it has a designer, the further similarities we could find between these two analogs, the greater likelihood that there will be other similarities. I'll expand on that with a description of what the analogical reasoning amounts to. In analogical reasoning, arguments by analogy are inductive. They're not deductive. When you're comparing two different things and trying to derive a conclusion from them, there's always the possibility that your premises are all true, but the conclusion still is false. And so instead it's best to interpret all arguments by analogy of the sort that we're looking at here as inductive. There's another type of argument that we could construe Paley's, the way we can look at Paley's account as an inference to the best explanation, which is another form of induction. And I'll describe the difference between those two arguments in more detail with Collins's argument, because his version, the more contemporary argument, is looking at what's called a fine-tuning argument for the existence of God. And he tries to avoid the problems inherent with analogical reasoning, in particular with analogical reasoning used to justify a designer for this one universe, which, of course, we've only got one, and we don't have other examples from which to compare. So that's a potential problem. We'll see that with David Hume as well when we look at the problems of design arguments. But if you look at the next slide, there's a wonderful image there of an elephant. A quote from G.K. Chesterton, who's a very quotable individual. So one elephant having a trunk was odd, but all elephants having trunks looked like a plot. And I don't know in context what he was talking about. I suspect he's talking about a variation of a design argument. A plot implies a plot maker, a plotter. And if there were only one elephant in the universe, and look at the thing, it's a very strange creature. It's quite a monstrosity if you just look at it for a few moments. But if we have a lot of them, then all of a sudden, yeah, that's an elephant. That's all that is. But it's quite odd. It's quite odd. They seem to have been made for a reason, a purpose. You look at the trunk, it has a particular function, a functionality to it. It has a job, it has a task. There's the eye, of course, we'll look at its mouth, its enormous ears for flapping. Everything about it appears to have a kind of function. And the Greek word telos, the root for teleological, means end, or purpose, or function. This teleological thinking, at least philosophically, influences and has influenced science and just about all other kinds of thinking since Aristotle. Aristotelian teleological thinking was incredibly influential, at least to the time of Galileo. Galileo burst some bubbles there, and then Darwin Galileo upended the Aristotelian reign of teleological thinking to a large extent. Whereas Darwin, as we'll see, showed at least a competing natural theory to teleology, with, of course, his theory of evolution, which we'll return to briefly. But the idea is that we can explain things that act in particular ways, in particular animals, through a functional account. We can do this with human beings. We can do this with solar systems. We can do this with galaxies. We can describe things in the way that we would a watch. If you go to the next, you see the typical examples, the typical images you see within the watch, as Paley starts his argument with a description. He says, in crossing a heath, which is, actually I should have looked that up. I think it's like a valley. It's like, think of flowers, and I don't know what a heath is, but look that up. Suppose I pitch, it's like a little valley or something. Suppose I pitched my foot against a stone, and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew, to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it, perhaps, be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired, how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. And he goes on for a long time describing what it is about something like what we could call now a teleological system. The watch, and if you look at the image there, all the internal gears, I mean, how watches work is just mind-boggling to me. It shows the limit of my technological understanding. But if you make these comparisons, and I'll fill in the arguments in standard logical form later on, but just to give the imagistic interpretation, the intuitive plausibility of this argument, especially if we think about it being in 1802, well before Darwin, even though we did have ancient Greek philosophers who had offered variations on what later became evolutionary theory. Let's put that to the side. But if you look at the Earth, what Collins will call the biosphere, if you look at all the intricate necessities for there to be, for instance, human life, for things to work in the way that we like for them to do, compare that to the watch, the intricate structure, the flywheels, the gears, the delicate structures involved. In every case we see, it's obvious to us that was made for a purpose, an end. It has an end. It has a goal to it. And now here's an interesting thing we'll return to with Hume. But the rock, in contrast to the watch, we could easily say, well, this rock, what's the reason for it to being here? What's the cause of it? It's the explanation. And we can give one. We could also say, well, it's always been here. And not need much else. There's no design behind this particular rock, at least in contrast with, of course, finding a watch. And even if this watch, if you go to the next slide, is broken or really weird, like the Salvador Dali image of a melting watch, or clock in this case. And he goes on and on about this. It doesn't matter that the image, that the object before us is broken, or we don't understand its function, as is the case with that weird red object there, which I'm not going to tell you right now what it is. I do have the answer for that in the slides at the end. But don't look. Just look at it. Look at the image there and tell me, see if you can figure out what it is before looking at the answer. It's not at all obvious until you get to the end and you realize, oh, I guess I see what the hell that is. This is, in any case, you know that's function. That it has a function. You know that has a purpose. You know that was put together for a reason, and it has an end or a goal. Even if you don't have a clue what that might be. Even if the thing is in fact broken. Right? You can imagine a Martian coming down to Earth and seeing what we call Stonehenge. You look at these rocks, these enormous boulders. I don't know what it's there for. I bet if I watched the History Channel, I would learn that aliens put them in that pattern. I think that's fairly obvious by now. In any case, we may not know why the aliens did that, but we know that they did it for a reason, and that it didn't, here's the key distinction, that it didn't happen by accident. Right? There's a variation of the principle of sufficient reason behind this argument. I don't know what Stonehenge is there for. Maybe it was a kind of ancient calendar, which I think is one of the hypotheses, or it had something to do with crops and figuring out when we should plant and when we shouldn't plant, or maybe they sacrificed druids there. It's not obvious. The point being, we know, however, as mysterious as it is, it displays functionality and design. And in fact, this talk of design is so embedded, again, probably largely from Aristotle, philosophically speaking, but also perhaps even evolutionarily speaking, if you want to be a bit anachronistic here. Remember our discussions going all the way back to the beginning of the semester when we were looking at descriptions of or why we have religious ideas so deeply embedded in every culture, seemingly at every time. And you remember Paul Bloom's discussion regarding the question of whether God is an accident. His contemporary psychological, evolutionary, biological account, remember how much he focused on our innate tendencies, as if we were hardwired to see intention, to perceive patterns, even when there may not be patterns. And Timothy Lenoir, who's a historian of science, puts it this way: teleological thinking, this functionality thinking, this ends, function, purpose, and so on. This teleological thinking has been steadfastly resisted by modern biology. And yet, in nearly every area of research, biologists are hard-pressed to find language that does not impute purposiveness to living forms. End quote. Now, linguistically, seemingly not being able to avoid using purposive language with respect to living forms, biological entities, is not the same as saying, therefore, all living things have a function, a purpose. However, it is interesting, to say the least. It is compelling that it seems almost inescapable. We just naturally jump to the use of language that implies function, purpose, to things that are natural. And this, of course, is going to be an issue when we get to Hume. We might ask, well, clearly things like watches have a function, have a purpose. And the watch, and here we get into the argument, is like the universe. It is like the earth. It is like the human eye, for example, in many respects. Now, the analogy rests upon what those respects are. Are they relevant comparisons, and so on. Therefore, since the watch has a designer, very likely the universe itself does as well. That raises all sorts of questions, as we're going to see, such as, well, what could the function of the universe be? It's not obvious to see the connection between those two. But let's get into the argument. First of all, for those of you who have taken logic or critical thinking, you'll know what analogical arguments are. As I mentioned, they're inductive rather than deductive. Induction gives us conclusions that follow from their premises with high degrees of probability, assuming the truth of the premises. So you're dealing with probability, you're not dealing with necessity. If in a deductive argument we assume the truth of the premises, they necessitate the conclusion has to be true, assuming the truth of the premises, you've got a deductively valid argument. If I were to say, to use the textbook case, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, that conclusion has to be true. You would be contradicting yourself if you said, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, but Socrates is immortal. That's a straightforward contradiction, the kind of which we saw, at least with going back to Anselm. You are basically saying Socrates is mortal, and also he's not mortal. That's an obvious contradiction. But you do not have that with respect to induction. It's never a contradiction to deny the truth of a conclusion, even when you assume the truth of all the premises. In other words, you could have all true premises in any inductive argument, and yet still the possibility, the logical possibility of a false conclusion. This does not mean that inductive arguments are bad because of that. Most of the reasoning we use most of the time is informal or inductive. And in fact, arguments by analogy are perhaps the most common form of reasoning that we use in just about all aspects of our lives. You want to buy a car. You want to get a car that gets good gas mileage. So you look at other cars that are analogous to the car that you want to buy. You have a friend, you know this friend drives the car that you want to get, right? It's the same make, it's the same model, it's the same size. It's stick shift versus automatic, and so on. The target car that you want to buy, you know these things about it. You know that it's the same size car as Bill's, your friend. It's the same transmission, whatever. It's got the same engine. It's got the same weight. The tires are the same size. The one thing you don't know about it for sure is whether or not it gets good gas mileage. But you do know that your friend's car, which again is relevantly analogous to yours in the ways that we just described, and many others, of course, to establish that it gets good gas mileage. And so you infer, given the similarities between these two cars, it's likely that further similarities will be found, right? Bill's car gets good gas mileage, your friend's car gets good gas mileage, and here are all the similarities. It's likely that there will be further similarities. Your car, the target car you want to buy, will likely get good gas mileage too. Now, they have to be relevant similarities. It may be that your car and the target car you want to buy and your friend's car are similar in all those respects, but they also have the same paint job. That is not obviously relevant to the conclusion, whether or not the feature in question, getting good gas mileage, is going to follow. What you're looking for in analogical arguments are the relevant similarities. And to give another grouping of kinds of analogical arguments, think of legal reasoning. Lawyers use analogical reasoning all the time. And they call it appeal to precedent, to preceding cases. I want to argue in a similar way to similar cases, or the phrase is, similar cases ought to be treated similarly. Pretty straightforward. So I have a current case, I'm defending my client, and I appeal to precedent. I say, look, here are the facts of the current case. And I lay them all out. Let's look at preceding cases that are properly analogous to this current one. Here are all the similarities in this prior case. Notice how they match up to the current case. And notice in that prior case, the jury or the judge ruled in favor of the defendant, let's say. Given the similarities between the current case, right, we don't know the guilt or innocence yet, we're trying to determine that. I appeal to these preceding cases and say, look at the similarities between the two cases. You ought to decide similarly. If the cases are relevantly similar, the decision in the end should be relevantly similar. The defendant was deemed not guilty, for example, in these original cases. And the more cases you have, by the way, the stronger your analogical argument is going to be. Right? I can appeal to Supreme Court cases, appellate cases, circuit court cases, for instance, the freedom of speech, right? All of these cases, I can appeal to a number of them and show how they are relevantly similar to the current case. We ought to then decide similarly. Now, the argument from the other side, let's say the prosecution, they're going to be looking for relevant disanalogies. So, to tie this in to Paley's watchmaker argument, there is clear purpose, there's order, there's design in a watch. This is unquestionable. The analogy, to put it bluntly, is the watch represents the world and everything in it, and the watchmaker represents God. So, a watch will have the following properties, A, B, C, and D, just to overly simplify. And for our purposes, D is going to be that it has a designer, that there is a watchmaker. No one is going to question this. No one is going to say, as Paley is telling us, Paley's not, by the way, arguing, hey, I think watches have designers, and here's the argument why I think watches have designers. That is not at all what he's doing. He's giving a clear case of that which has design and is designed, and showing again, if interpreting this as an analogical argument, and showing the relevant similarities between this and non-human artifacts, right? Human artifact like a watch is something we know about. The non-human artifacts, that's what we're getting at, right? By the way, my children are not my artifacts. I didn't make them or design them. I procreated them, so there's that. But they're not artifacts. They're not things with function in them that I had intentionally designed. And so we have to then see how the human artifacts are properly analogous to that which are not human artifacts. And so the universe, not a human artifact, also, Paley would say, has the properties A, B, and C. Question is, does it have D? Does it have a designer? Well, if you look at the way we've been viewing arguments by analogy in general, the kind we use all the time, it seems likely to infer that it does. The universe also probably, again, it's inductive, not deductive, probably has a designer. And so again, I focus on that to show you that the argument is not weak because it's inductive. Although I think non-philosophers tend to think that that's the case. Years ago, Kirk Cameron was his name, I think, TV star from 80s show, Growing Pains, maybe? Yeah, it doesn't matter. He was on television pushing a variation of this argument, of the design argument. And the argument by analogy, he didn't call it that, I can't remember the words he used. He made the case that, or he stated that, Kirk Cameron did, that this argument, and it was a variant of Paley's argument, actually it was closer to a variant of Aquinas' fifth way, as you recall, the way by design. It was much closer to that. And in the end, Cameron says this argument shows with absolute scientific certainty, 100%, he says, 100% scientific certainty that God exists. And I found that strange, so strange that I apparently have memorized that quote. I bet if you looked it up, you would find that's what he said. He's mistaken on a number of accounts. Number one, all analogical arguments are inductive, as we said before, and all inductive arguments only at best can give us a high degree of probability. So we might say this is a strong inductive argument, but we wouldn't say the conclusion follows with necessity. And in science, to remind us, scientists do not provide us with absolute 100% certainty in anything. You're doing something other than science if you feel you've arrived at a conclusion with 100% certainty. Okay, anyway, on we go. The more complex an object is, the more complex a system is. The Paley argument goes, the greater likelihood that there is evidence of purpose and of a designer that is intelligent, that is not just sort of an accident, that there was a purpose, there was a reason behind it. Which takes us to Paley's argument, which I put in standard logical form. I have two versions of it. There's a lot of different versions, as we'll see when we get to Collins next time. The structure of the argument is as follows. Premise 1, machines are produced by intelligent design. Use the watch as an example. You can come up with any other example you want. Human artifacts. Premise 2, the universe resembles a machine. Conclusion, therefore, probably the universe was produced by intelligent design. It's premise 2, of course, that requires significant work. The universe resembles a machine. In what way does it resemble a machine? And why is that sufficient to then conclude there is a designer? And as we'll return to this question, I don't want to do it now, but when we see with Collins and after Collins with Hume, what, or rather how do we bridge the gap from the designer to the kind of designer that Paley, for instance, might want? That is, okay, this argument looks nice. It's convincing. It's the most convincing argument for most people today. But why do we get God out of the intelligent designer? To expand on the argument, the next slide, slide 11 here, this is closer to what Paley's saying. Premise 1, human artifacts are products of intelligent design. The universe resembles human artifacts. And again, there we find the comparisons. Collins' next reading, we'll see, gives us significant details, maybe too many, of how there are not just similarities between human artifacts and non-human artifacts in the universe, but in fact, he's going to argue from a probabilistic account, saying that it's highly improbable that these non-human artifacts, like the Earth, like the solar system, like the universe itself, could have come about without a designer. That's a variation that attempts to avoid some of the problems that Hume raised with respect to design arguments that were analogical, like Paley's. In any case, the universe resembles human artifacts, therefore the universe is a product of intelligent design, but the universe is complex and gigantic in comparison to human artifacts, therefore there probably is a powerful and vastly intelligent designer who created the universe. Again, the argument is, it seems absurd to think, if you look at the eye, that, as in fact Paley puts this explicitly, the examination of the eye, he says this on page 37 somewhere, I think, actually. No, where does he talk about the eye? Page 34, excuse me. And he spends a lot of time on the eye. The examination of the eye is a cure for atheism. It's a fantastic phrase he gives there. And you can see the human eye. It shows the retina, the cornea, the lens, the pupil, the iris, the anatomy of the eye. You can see the development in multiple species. There's an eagle, I think, or a hawk. I don't know what that is. I'm pretty sure that's an eagle. The eyes are set in the front. Those are sort of predators. And if you look at the, what is that gecko-like creature at the bottom that's licking its eyeball, that's awesome. I don't know that they have eyelids. Paley talks a lot about eyelids and how it's a kind of what we would call windshield wiper, how it cleanses the eye. It seems so intricate, amazingly complex, way more complex than any human invention. Again, this is in 1802. This is before, of course, the rise of artificial intelligence, something we might talk about again. But the structure of the eye seems what later philosophers of science, Michael Behe in particular, and Dembski, I forgot his first name, Dembski, would argue have what we call irreducible complexity. It seems built like something like a mousetrap, where it couldn't have come about accidentally, piecemeal, bits at a time. The argument goes, the eye could only have functionality and work if it were designed as such. All of the parts working in place, designed collectively. Not over time, not piecemeal. Same thing with a mousetrap. Unless all of the parts are put together simultaneously, structured in such a way that the mechanism will work, provided all of the relevant pieces are together. If you took one piece at a time, you would never get a working mousetrap. The mousetrap is an example of something of irreducible complexity. Unless all of the parts are working in tandem simultaneously, you do not have a mousetrap. Unless you have all of the parts of the eye, and the eye is incredibly complex. And then its connection to the occipital cortex is even more complex. Unless you have all of that, the eye doesn't work, the argument goes. And he goes on, Paley does, at length. He doesn't talk about the shark, but if you notice the shark eye is fascinating. You can see it has, its eyelid is like a shield. That seems obviously, again, teleological language. It has a function to protect that eye. It is there in order to protect it. Our eyes are made so that we can see. This language is almost impossible to avoid. And we didn't make these eyes, of course. This design inherent within some of the most complex non-human artifacts cries out for an explanation. The inherent design in it cries out for a designer. And you see the last one there, the development of the eye in multiple species. I'll return to that when we look at Hume and problems with the design argument. Because there are debates within evolutionary science, but in the philosophy of science in particular, that counter the view that the eye, for instance, is that which has irreducible complexity and could not have evolved over time. In fact, this image here actually shows, is the basis of a possible argument, that it has evolved over time, multiple times, and in multiple ways, and piecemeal. Over time, you've got primitive eyes that only perceive movement or light, to the eagle eye, which sees extremely long distances, and so on. But we'll return to that later. But what Paley ends with, that is this argument proves not just that there's a designer, but there proves the personality of the deity. And that's an interesting word to use. But we've seen it already with the cosmological arguments, with the Kalam cosmological argument in particular. The idea that if there is a cause of something that brought something about, you've got two approaches to it. There's a physical, purely causal, mechanistic explanation. That's one way of describing things. We use that in physics all the time. But then you've also got the personal causal factor. You might think of this in terms of psychology. Why is it that you behaved in that way? Is a different kind of question than how did his arm move that direction in that way. I can give a causal, physical explanation for something that may not invoke any reasons. But when you look at objects like a watch, we cannot be content with a purely physical causal explanation. Surely we say that cries out for a reasons. That object has a function, it has a purpose, and things with purpose must have had purposers, the argument goes. They must have had a goal in mind with its construction. And the complexity, the vastness, if you look at the DNA, I don't want to get too much into the contemporary science of it because Paley was unaware of that, but much of the argument that Paley offers is expanded upon with contemporary biology, with the DNA sequencing, with contemporary physics and astrophysics, with the complexities, and along with that with chemistry, with the complexities of cellular life, with complexities of electromagnetic forces, all of which seem perfectly suited, or, as we'll see with Collins next time, fine-tuned by some kind of divine creator, divine designer, surely greater than any human designer. All of this seems to cry out for that kind of explanation. And if you hadn't jumped yet to the last thing, I hope you haven't, it's of course an apple corer and peeler. Looking at that object, it's not very clear. But then when you're told, you realize, oh, I see how that could work. And it looks pretty impressive bit of machinery. That clearly has a design, and it's pretty complex, actually quite impressive. When we get to Collins' argument, we'll see a great deal of depth and detail given to the kind of detail that Paley gave with respect to the eye. Collins is going to offer that as an argument with respect to the universe, the cosmos as a whole. And instead of an analogical argument, which again we'll return to this with Hume in particular, He's giving an argument that's known as a probabilistic argument. It's inductive. It's called an inference to the best explanation. Technically, it's called an abductive argument. That is the argument we will return to next time. And after that, we'll look at Hume. And in looking at Hume, we'll have returned to Paley's arguments and see whether or not Hume's critiques of Paley's arguments might also in some way apply to Collins's arguments. Okay, that was a relatively short one. I will talk to you soon. Thank you.